Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on the call today. If it's your first time, welcome. If you joined us before, welcome back. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining through your computer's audio or dialing in via telephone. If you have difficulty to connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies, the host, using the chat box. On a PC or laptop, the chat box is on the right-hand side. If you're using a phone or tablet, you will have to toggle the view to see this. To manage the session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted, so if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box. The button is at the bottom. If you're using a PC or laptop, again, the Q&A button is to the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you're using a smartphone or tablet, again, you may have to toggle this, so please have a quick look now. Please also use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features such as participant videos that you may find distracting. I should also note that this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry when voting. Today's session is on transport security. It's planned to last for about 45 minutes, with a question and answer session throughout the presentation, as well as at the end. The session is being recorded and will be available for download or viewing via YouTube after the session. At the end of the session, there will be a short questionnaire for your feedback. This is useful for us to see, firstly, if you liked the format of today's session and any recommendations on the format. Secondly, if you have any topics you would like covered or have projects you would like to share with the community, to please let us know. Now, without further ado, today I'm pleased to announce that we're joined by Mr. Ben Wittard, the Director of Safety, Security and Environment at International Nuclear Services Limited. Thank you. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Carl, and a very good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I join you this morning from a very warm Manchester, England. It's actually the hottest day of the year. And as many of you will know, the UK is famous for not having any air conditioning. So I'll apologise now for any background noise. The windows are open, so please do bear with me. And I'm here today to talk to you about the wonderful world of transport, something I've been involved in now for probably well over a decade, something that's very close to my heart. And as Carl mentioned, this is an interactive session, so please do post questions as we go along, and I will do my best to answer them as we go along. But we're also going to pause throughout the presentation and have a bit of a Q&A, a bit of a discussion as well, just so we don't have to do all the questions at the end. But before we get into the presentation, we're going to kick off with a poll. So we'll move to the next slide, and I'd really like to know which part of the nuclear sector do you work in? I'm keen to understand who we've got on the call today. So we'll just spend a little bit of time getting those polls in. I appreciate some of you will need to toggle across to open the application. So looking forward to hearing more about who we've got on the call. Fantastic. Quite a few regulators on. Good morning. Quite a few others. Okay. So that's interesting. So we've got quite a good distribution across the regulatory sphere. Quite a few from government, 10 from government, 13 from others, I'm guessing probably educational background, academia, a few from the operators, very few transport companies. That's quite interesting. Great, okay. Fantastic. Well, maybe as we get into the Q&A later, I might ask you a bit more about some of your backgrounds, just so we can draw some interesting examples out for you. Fantastic. So we'll stop there and we will move on to the plan for today, if that's okay. Fantastic. So today we're going to be talking a bit about transport security, a bit about some practicalities of implementing transport security. And I know that many of you on the call will have already sat through some of my previous presentations on fundamentals. So we're going to try and build on some of those things, but we also have quite a few new participants. So we are going to touch on some of those as well. So we're going to begin by talking about the role that transport plays in the nuclear sector. We're then going to touch on the international framework for nuclear security and some of the kind of the basic principles of transport security. And then we're going to dive straight in to focusing on three key areas, three key modes of transport, to talk a little bit more in detail about the pros and cons, some of the challenges and opportunities that might exist within each of these areas. So we're going to talk about sea, we're talking about rail, and we're going to talk about road as well. But what I would say is, and we'll talk about it later, that there are other modes of transport, but we can talk about them at another time just due to time constraints. Okay, so hopefully that sounds good, and we will jump straight in. So next slide, please, Isabel. Thank you. So I'm also the chair of the World Nuclear Transport Institute's Transport Security Working Group, and I'm very privileged to be a part of that role. And one of the things I do during my role at WINTI is I talk about the important role transport plays. And many of you on the call, we had some operators, we had some government officials, will be aware that the entire fuel cycle is predicated on being able to move nuclear materials around. So whether that's natural uranium or uranium ores, UO2, UF6 being moved to enrichment facilities, enriched materials being moved to fuel fabrication facilities, that fuel then being delivered to nuclear reactors, and then the spent fuel being moved either for long-term storage or disposal, or potentially even reprocessing, relies heavily upon the transport sector. And the transport sector is from my perspective, the unsung hero. We work very, very hard behind the scenes to ensure that the nuclear fuel sector continues to operate effectively. And as we go through today, I'll try and draw upon some of this in a bit more detail to really hit home the importance of that transport plays in doing so. But you'll also appreciate that the security that sits around these transports is also very unique, and we'll also touch on that today as well. So again, Isabel, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So traditionally there are 5 key modes of transport, and we're going to talk about 3 of them today. So in the top left-hand corner, you'll see a PNTL vessel. So that's one of the vessels that the company I work for operates, Pacific Nuclear Transport Limited. We transport materials all around the world, all the way from very low category radioactive materials, all the way up to separated plutonium and MOX fuel. The second picture there is road transport. Again, a very popular form of transport, particularly within certain countries. Very, very popular. The next, which is something we're not talking about today, is air transport, but it is very, very prevalent. And you can see there, I think that's a picture of a Russian movement of HEU that took place. In the bottom left, rail transportation, again, very, very popular within domestic countries, but also transiting through mainland areas such as Europe. That's actually a picture of our sister company, Direct Rail Services, who are pretty much the world leaders in the rail transport of nuclear materials. And very, very encourage you to go away and have a look at their website if you're interested in rail in more detail. And then finally, inland waterways, which is something we don't always talk about, but in Central Europe and other regions is a very popular form of transport due to obviously the rivers that exist, either natural or man-made. So lots and lots of different modes of transport available to you. But again, today we're just going to be focusing on marine, road and rail. But if you're interested in any of the other modes, please do feel free to get in touch with me. My details will be at the end of the presentation, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you more about those modes in detail. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide, and we've got another question for you. So this is, again, just to allow me to get to know who's on the call. So which mode of transport is most popular in your country for either radioactive material transports or nuclear transports? Okay, so road, clear winner so far. a bit of rail. Very small sea, no inland waterway. That's interesting. Okay, that's useful. That's helpful. So that kind of shows you, I think, obviously for domestic transports, road very, very popular. Rail will be more popular for some countries due to the environmental factors involved. Sea not so popular. I guess that's because I asked you what's most popular within your country. Clearly, if it's for transports transiting the world, sea is a very popular choice along with air. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. We will move on, Isabel, if that's okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the international framework. And what I really want to get across to you today on this is all radioactive materials, all nuclear materials are captured by some form of regulation. And that's all you really need to know today. I'm not going to talk about everybody's regulations in detail. But the regulations will differ according to the type, form and quantity of material. And we'll talk a little bit about material categorization later. So at the most basic level, all radioactive materials are considered dangerous goods. And therefore they fall under a range of dangerous goods regulations. In Europe, most commonly it's the modal regulations, which are stipulated from the Orange Book. But for some of those radioactive materials, because of their type, form and quantity, particularly uranium and plutonium, they're considered nuclear materials, and therefore they also attract additional regulations. And above both those two things, it's also important to highlight that there are also additional intergovernmental agreements that exist around the world, and we may touch on some of those later during the Q&A as well. But the important thing to say is, for nuclear materials, the responsibility to set regulations sits entirely with the state concerned. This also extends to any vessels which is flagged and registered to its flag in its country. So a very quick snapshot into the international framework, but we're now going to move on to focus on the Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials, and then we'll delve deeper to understand how that flows down into domestic national regulations. So next slide, please, Isabel. Great, thank you. So many of you on the call will have heard of the Convention for the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials. I will refer to it as the CPPNM just for ease. So this is the only legally binding international convention concerning the physical protection of nuclear materials. And it also covers international transport, which is really important, and places a number of obligations on countries to either ensure protection, so to ensure that security is being delivered effectively, or to gain assurance that security is being applied correctly. And these obligations are placed on either sending, so that's the country that is sending material, receiving, the country that is receiving the material, or transit states. And transit states are those countries where material might transit through during a transportation. So for example, if a sea shipment's being taken place and the vessel leaves, say, the UK on the way to Spain, but it has to pop into a French port on the way, France will be deemed a transit country. The material won't go anywhere further in the country, it will just transit at the port and then move on. So this is really important, and the convention also places obligations on states to establish measures to prevent, detect, and also to create offences relating to nuclear material as well. Now there are two elements to the CPPNM. There is the original convention, which was, I believe, signed around 1974, and then there is the amended convention, which was published very recently in the last few years. And therefore, I would advise you, if you're not aware of the document, go away and have a read of it. It's a really interesting document, and also try to go away and understand whether your country is a state party to the convention or its amendment as well, just to understand where you stand in your country. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Isabel, thank you. So sat beneath this legally binding instrument are a whole host of recommendation documents. And they are recommendations because, as we mentioned earlier, the responsibility for setting nuclear security regulations sits with the state. And it's in this way because the factors that you need to consider to establish an appropriate security regime will differ. So, what's happening in the UK today will differ hugely than what's happening in, say, Japan at the moment, for example, which is a country that I work in quite regularly. So you need to take those environmental factors into account, the different threat environments which countries have to operate in, and therefore it's totally appropriate for a state to have that central responsibility. So these documents, which are published by the IAEA, but are actually built by all of the member states, and a lot of time and effort goes into building these recommendation documents, are really, really effective in terms of building good practice. So these are recommendations, they're good practice. These are the things you should do. And the one that I've highlighted here is NSS 13, or commonly referred to as InfoCirc 225 Revision 5. And again, I would really encourage you to go away and have a look at this document, as well as some of the others that exist as well, particularly those for transport, such as NSS number 9, considering the security of transport of radioactive materials, but also NSS 26G, which concerns the security of nuclear materials in transport. So we talked about the convention, legally binding. We've talked about the good practice that exists in terms of the recommendations that exist in other good practice guides. We're now going to show you how this flows down into a domestic set of regulations. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Isabel. Thank you. So this is just a representation of how it works here in the UK. So as you can see, the UK ratified the amendment to the convention back in 2010. So that means we've committed to that convention. We're legally obligated to meet the obligations set out in it. And then you can also see all of the other good practice guides which sit beneath it. So we need to comply with everything up here. We're going to take into account all of the good practice that exists. And we're going to take all that good information, we're going to feed it into the UK's regulations and regulatory establishment. So if we move on to the next slide, I can show you how that works. And in the UK, that's done through the creation of regulations. So we've got something called the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act, which is something we call an enabling piece of legislation that allows the Secretary of State here in the UK to create laws. And that's really important. It's a statute given by Parliament. And from that, we created something called the Nuclear Industry Security Regulations, which are a very prescriptive set of regulations. And it includes elements such as, to transport nuclear material, you will be an approved carrier. You will employ trustworthy individuals. You will protect sensitive nuclear information. You will do these things. You must do these things. If you don't do these things effectively, you will essentially be breaking the law and subject to enforcement in the future. But what those regulations don't do is give any detail on how you comply with them. They're quite high level, quite prescriptive, quite clear. But sat beneath that, we also have something called the Security Assessment Principles, which is an outcome-based form of regulation. So many of you on the call will be operating within a prescriptive form of regulation where your regulator says you must do X, Y, and Z. Here in the UK, we don't operate like that. Basically, what we have is an outcome-based system where the regulator says, you will protect nuclear material from theft and sabotage. Demonstrate to us how you're going to do that. And that's a really empowering way of regulating the industry here in the UK. It allows us to go away and develop security measures that are fit for purpose for our needs. Because you'll appreciate, the measures that we carry out on board an INS vessel, a PNTL vessel, is very, very different to the measures that need to be applied on a nuclear site, for example. So it's a really useful form of regulations. But hopefully you can see from these two very simple slides how the convention flows down and is embodied within the regulations that we've created in the UK. So if we could move on to the next slide, we're actually going to pause now, and I'm going to have a quick look at some of the Q&A questions. We've got a couple of questions here. So I'm going to kick off with the first one, which is from Alex Barrow here in the UK. Hi, Alex. Good to see you. So what is the most popular mode of transport for nuclear materials in the UK? Good question. So in the UK, and I check these stats quite regularly, the most popular form of transport of nuclear materials is rail. And that might be surprising to you, but actually it makes a lot of sense, because the majority of moves in the UK are movements of spent fuel from reactors. So as many of you will know, we've got a fleet of operating reactors in the UK managed by EDF, and the spent fuel from those reactors is moved to Sellafield site in Cumbria, and that's done by our sister company, Direct Rail Services, who I mentioned earlier. So that's the most popular form of transport. After that, the next popular form of domestic transport is road. And then finally, for international transports, the most popular mode is marine. You know, and obviously we're heavily involved in a lot of those transports. So thank you, Alex, for that question. The next one is from Samran Ali. So, do IAEA's regulations regarding the safe transportation of nuclear materials also apply to those materials and facilities that are not under the IAEA's safeguards? That is an excellent question. I would have to defer that one, if that's okay, Samran. But we will do our best to try and answer that. If not during the presentation today, we'll certainly answer it after it. So, if I could ask Isabel and Carl to make sure we note that one down. We've also got Mark Fearcroft on the line. Mark, good to see you. For multimodal transport, are other regulatory frameworks such as maritime security laws or rail security laws applicable? Absolutely. So as I mentioned slightly earlier in the presentation, all materials are governed by modal regulations, because all nuclear materials are considered dangerous goods. So, you know, if we're moving nuclear material on board a ship, for example, we're required to comply with our nuclear security regulations, but we're also required to comply with a whole host of maritime specific regulations. So the SOLAS Convention, the SOLAS Convention, for example, the ISPS code, the INF code, there's a whole host of them. And the same goes for rail as well. So in Europe, obviously, we comply with RID as part of the European Commission. So yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Next question is from Suchita. Are there any guidelines for monitoring instrumentation to be installed in vehicles? So there isn't much in terms of IAEA good practice on monitoring instrumentation. I assume you mean for heat and for other kind of safety critical features as well as security. However, there is some really good practice out there available. I would certainly encourage you to have a look at the WINTI website. There's also some educational institutions who do an awful lot of work on instrumentation monitoring during transport, as well as the security side. So Argonne National Labs in the US is a really good place to go and have a look at. I'm pretty sure they've got a website. We can try and get the link to that after this presentation, if that works. Great, okay, so I think that's all of the questions we've received. Oh no, we've had another one come in from Mohammed. Hi Mohammed. So we've got, what security measures are applied during nuclear transportation in the UK? Stakeholders, that includes domestic and international. Mohammed, what I'll do is we're going to come on to that in a second. So I won't answer that now, but we'll talk about it in just a second, if that's okay. So we'll keep that one open as an open question, and hopefully we answer it. If not, we'll come back to it. Nojib, good to see you. What is the role of the I guess the regulator during the transport of nuclear materials? So the regulator's role in the UK is very much one of enforcing the security regulations. So they're required to approve carriers in the UK. So anybody who wants to transport nuclear materials need to be approved. They do this through the submission of a transport security statement, which basically outlines their security measures. And then they are an approved carrier. And then depending on the type of transport they conduct, they're either required to submit a transport security plan for approval, that's particularly for the Cat 1 and Cat 2 materials, or if it's for Category 3, they only need to produce one for internal use, but it is subject to audit. So they're heavily involved in all of the moves from a regulatory perspective. Okay, we're getting quite a few questions in now. We may need to move on, just conscious of time. So I'll do two more. And Martin, don't be offended, I'm going to move over yours, if that's okay, but we'll leave it open and I'll come back to it. Okay, so this, just for everyone's benefit, there is still much more of the presentation to go. We're not finished yet.
Thanks, Ben. And don't forget, we have a separate Q&A slot later in this, and we have Q&A at the end, so we can move on, and then we can answer any questions.
Fantastic. That's a good idea. Let's move on then. Thanks everybody for your questions. This is really good. I like an interactive session. So now we're going to focus on looking at the basic principles of transport security. So Isabel, if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we already mentioned the responsibility of the state, and we've also mentioned about the state's responsibility for creating regulations and the need to create or designate a competent authority under the CPPNM, which is really important. But there's a few other kind of bits I wanted to cover off. The first is kind of understanding the responsibilities of those involved in a transport, and this is really important because you'll appreciate there may be lots of different sections to a transport. And different carriers involved, different operators involved. And therefore understanding who's involved is really, really important, and agreeing clear handovers of security responsibility to ensure that there is a that the security measures are continued consistently throughout the whole transport. The next thing I wanted to cover off is threat. So again, really important, if you're designing security measures for a transport, you really need to understand the threat environment in which you're working in. Now, for prescriptive countries that adopt prescriptive regulations, this is less important because essentially the competent authority or government will interpret that threat for you. But for those countries adopting an outcome-based focused regulation, you really need to get hold of that threat information and understand what's going on a transport by transport basis. The next thing I wanted to cover is very quickly is defence in depth. So quite often people say to me, well, Ben, transport must be really vulnerable because you can't implement defence in depth. And what we mean by defence in depth is creating multiple layers of security that if one of them is circumvented, the security system doesn't fail because you've got multiple layers. So a really good example of that is the onion ring. So if you cut an onion in half, you've got lots of rings. If you imagine there are different sets of security measures, you might have barriers, you might have cameras, detection systems, guards, for example, on a site. If one of those elements were to fail, you still have all the other measures to protect you. And what I say for transport is exactly the same. It's just the measures are different. And we'll kind of touch on that a little bit later when we talk about road and rail transport, specifically in marine transports. And then finally, just to finish off this slide, again, these are just some of the basics. Contingency and emergency plans are really, really important. And we're going to touch on these later as well. But ensuring that you have clear procedures in place to respond to nuclear transport incidents, whether security or not, is going to be really, really important. So if we move on to the next slide, we're going to focus a little bit on threats. I've already mentioned that understanding the threat is going to be really important. And it's quite hard to talk about threats on these types of webinars because each country is going to adopt this in a very, very different way. But what I would say is if you're an operator or if you're a government official or a regulator, understanding what you need to protect against is really, really important. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. And I just want to kind of canter through some of the basics here. I'm not going to get into too much detail. The first concerns the threat assessment. So the threat assessment is based on lots and lots of different sorts of intelligence that your country will collect. And it considers how likely a threat will materialize. So how likely is it going to take place? Is it going to happen immediately? It might happen? Is it actually going to happen maybe once in 10 years, once in a 100-year event, etc., etc.? So how likely is it going to take place? The next thing is to consider a design basis threat, which describes what your state believes are the likely capabilities of the threat. So how many people do they think would be involved in an attack? What type of weapons might they use? What kind of tactics would they use in terms of conducting an attack? And once you've got these two things, you're then able to have a really informed, educated view of what the security needs to look like. And then you'll be able to conduct vulnerability assessments, whether that's electronic ones and simulator modeling online, or actually kind of assessments walking the ground, to really identify whether there's any gaps between what the threat looks like and what your security measures are. And then finally, and this is a question I get quite often, so I thought I'd include it early in the presentation, which is this concept of beyond design basis. So this is anything that is beyond the design basis threat is considered beyond design basis. So these are things that you wouldn't be expected to protect against, but actually the responsibility for protection would move to probably the government. So this is, state-sponsored acts, for example. An operator in a country, who's a private limited company would not be expected to protect against the military of another state. So those types of threats are considered beyond design basis. But in doing so, the key thing in getting a clear understanding of the threat is to focus on theft. What's the threat of theft? What's the threat of sabotage? And finally, which is something that isn't talked about very commonly, is what is the threat to your reputation? What we're talking about here is not necessarily malicious attacks, but attacks from NGOs, domestic extremism, those types of things. Okay, so we're going to canter on, conscious of time, and next we're going to focus on the graded approach. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, Isabel. Thank you. So to ensure that we're adopting proportionate security measures, it's really important that we apply a graded approach to transports. And what I mean by that is, I wouldn't expect a transporter, let's say there's two trucks driving down the same motorway. I wouldn't expect the one truck, which contains, 10 kilograms of separated plutonium, to have the same security measures being applied to it as the other truck, which is maybe carrying a low activity radioactive source, for example. It would be wholly disproportionate, and actually it would be very detrimental to industry, because industry just wouldn't be able to operate or compete. So for nuclear material, we use a categorization methodology to do that, and many of you will know this already, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. And this table here, I think, was probably taken from InfoCirc 225 NSS 13, and it basically shows roughly how materials are categorized for uranium and plutonium and irradiated fuel. Now, what I would say is, if you've never categorized fuel before, it's really actually very simple. It's based on type, form, and quantity. But what I would say is, again, because it's a state's responsibility to set regulations, this table may differ slightly from state to state. And as a transport company who moves material around the world on a weekly basis, we feel that strain sometimes. So, I might be moving material from the UK through to another country, and we may need to pass through 4 or 5 different other countries, and we may go from Cat 3 to Cat 2 to Cat 3 to Cat 2 as we go through different countries, and that can be really challenging and quite difficult to manage. But it's something which I want you all to be cognizant of as you move forward in your respective journeys. And if we move on to the next slide, Isabel, we're now going to quickly touch on some of what I call the generic basic security principles. These are outlined in NSS 13. They're also outlined in 26G as well, the IAEA's Good Practice Guide. So again, some really basic things. What can you do to reduce the risk of security on your transports? First one is you can avoid regular timings. So if you're moving material every Monday morning at 9 AM on the dot, 365 days a year, that's going to be a really good indicator to somebody who wants to do you harm. That, pretty much a dead cert. The next is another obvious one. Avoid areas of natural disaster, civil disorder, high risk areas. It's actually an interesting one at the moment, even for here in the UK. So lots of protests going on at the moment, completely nothing to do with the nuclear industry. But, for a transport to get caught up in one of those protests or any sort of kind of natural disaster or issue, potentially an election campaign with protests going on, for example, is something you just want to avoid. It will make your life very uncomfortable. The next one is, again, reduce the total time in transport. So if you're driving from one city to another to transport some fuel, you may want to take the most direct route. You may want to kind of take a different route, but reducing the total time will reduce your time at risk, which is really, really important. Again, reducing the total number of transports required. So again, if you can reduce them by moving larger quantities, that can be helpful. But sometimes you may want to split quantities because of the security measures. It's not something I'm a big fan of, but I know it happens. Reducing advanced knowledge is also a very important pointer. So protecting the information associated with your transports and making it strictly need to know. So those who really need to know it is really useful. I mean, we actually adopt this very strictly within INS. So only those who absolutely need to know the detail of dates and times know that information, and other people in the company just have no access to it whatsoever. And then finally, obviously seeking the trustworthiness of those involved, and that's a subject which we could probably talk about all day on this webinar, but we won't. But what I would say is, with all these types of measures, again, one size doesn't fit all, and we need to be practicable and pragmatic in our approach to these types of measures. So avoiding regular timings can be difficult. If you've got a rail slot at the same time every week. Reducing the total time in transport, you might say, well, actually, there is some civil disorder going on over there, therefore I'm going to take a longer route. So it needs to be practicable, it needs to be mindful, it needs to be risk balanced as you move forward. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide, please, Isabel, which is actually a question, another poll question. So I want you to tell me, from your perspective, is nuclear material more vulnerable during transport? Yes or no? And what I mean by that, by comparatively to sites. Right. This is interesting. So we've got 51 of 84, so about 60% of us. Great. Okay. So the overwhelming feeling I'm getting is everybody thinks nuclear material is more vulnerable, and that's interesting. So this is a question. I'm very fortunate. I also present at the ONR, our regulator in the UK, the ONR's introductory security course for new security professionals, and it's a question I ask them, and everybody says yes, nuclear material is more vulnerable. And I actually disagree. So I disagree with 88% of you on the call, and that's fine. That's good. It's a healthy debate. The way I describe it, and it's slightly a play on words, is nuclear material might be more attractive in transport because it's perceived to be more vulnerable, but it's only as vulnerable as the security measures you apply to it. So if you're applying really good, robust security measures, that makes sense. Nuclear material in transport isn't more vulnerable. It just might be more attractive. So it's a bit of a trick question, but I want you to think about that as we move forward. Is it more vulnerable? No, it's not. It's just the security bubble needs to change. We can't rely on fences, etc., like a big fixed site, but we can apply different measures in transport to make it safe and secure. And I say that because it's one of the reasons why transports have a really good track record. Yes, we've had a few incidents in recent years, radioactive sources in Mexico, etc., but overall, really, really safe and secure. And that's a representation of the great work that industry, the regulator, and the government does to work collectively to protect those materials. So we'll move on to a quick question. Get my words out. Question and discussion session. So. I'm going to limit this to 4 minutes just because of time. I know that some of you will have other meetings to go to. So an interesting question from Ali Mohammed Jidda. So how do you monitor movement of nuclear material and radioactive material within the country? So I can tell you how we do it in the UK. So in the UK, we actually submit a transport notification to the regulator, which outlines when materials will be moved and on what basis. However, the monitoring of the movement itself is done by the operator. So it's not done by a central police authority or a central regulator. It's monitored by the operators themselves. Again, it kind of goes back to that outcome-based methodology we have in the UK. But I do know that other countries, I think France, I don't know if there's anybody from France on the line, I think France monitor it from a central location, which is kind of government sanctioned to do so. But I'm sure I could get the answer to that if you're interested in more. And the other one from Ali Mohammed is, can I please share NISA? Absolutely, we can send you the link. That's all open source, that's not a problem. I'd also say that the security assessment principles is open source as well. So that's basically the UK's detailed security regulations, which is all open source and you can read. I'd encourage you to do so. So Beatrice has got a question. Transport of radioactive materials and nuclear materials faces a variety of challenges, and there are a number of emerging issues in the wider nuclear industry that have important implications for transport. How can I be sure that the security measures that are taken are sufficient? So what I would say, Beatrice, is what you're talking about is assurance. And there are three layers to assurance. There's frontline assurance, there's second line assurance, and there's third line. And I'll quickly talk you through each of the layers because it is quite a detailed conversation, but we can talk after. I'm more than happy to talk after. So firstly is the front line. So are the processes and procedures fit for purpose? So the people involved in the transport and people involved in establishing the nuclear security measures can assess whether things are appropriate or not. You can use KPIs, you can use vulnerability assessments, you can use modelling. There's a whole list of information. The second line is really focused on independence within your company. So you may have a central audit team or a central assurance team who can do independent assurance using standards. And then finally, the third line is external assurance. So regulators, maybe other kind of standards and industry bodies. I'm sure you could call upon other people in industry to do benchmarking as well. So lots of different ways, but we can cover that separately if that's okay. Great. Okay, so I think, conscious of time, we're going to move on. Again, lots of really great questions. So I'm sure we can get to them at the end. We're now going to focus on those three measures, three modes in more detail, and we're going to do that over the next kind of 10 minutes or so. So first off, we're going to talk about roads. Thanks, Isabel. So we mentioned earlier, really common form of transport. As we saw from the poll earlier as well, very popular in your countries, I can see, which is great. Transports are great because they give you a flexibility. They allow you to adopt lots of different routes, either proactively and reactively. So there's an issue, like we mentioned earlier, maybe some civil unrest or maybe some sort of an emergency in an area or an environmental incident. You can use a different route, which is really good. Then the one thing I would say is they're not great in terms of the quantities of materials you can move, unless you're obviously operating in a huge convoy, which can be quite convoluted. Again, the other challenge with road transport specifically is the kind of the public interaction piece. Not an issue per se, but you will need to manage that effectively, particularly if you're sharing motorways or roads with other road users. And again, if you're moving high category materials through lots of different counties or administrative areas in your state or states in your countries, then you'll have to work with lots of different authorities to achieve that. Another challenge is around the length of the transports involved. So if you're doing long transports by road, again, you're going to have to really think carefully about how you plan for rest periods for drivers. So in the UK we've got regulations around how many hours a driver can drive for, how much rest they require. You may want to consider having multiple crews to kind of do crew changing. You're also going to have to think about refueling and how that's all going to work. And in doing so, I mean, it can be quite challenging to do that work, particularly if it's a new route you're using. But one thing that we've done here in the UK is we operate something which is called the approved rest stop process, whereby operators in the UK work together to identify good, safe places to stop. So that might be motorway areas that are that have a police presence, for example. You know, gated areas that are well floodlit that you can stop and do crew changes, etc. So lots of different ways you can mitigate that challenge. I mentioned opportunistic theft. So we mentioned earlier about kind of malicious theft, etc. We, from a road perspective, we see quite a lot of opportunistic theft attempts. I haven't seen any recently, I might add, but over the past kind of decade or so. So you need to be really mindful about that, which is, if you're a truck on the road, people may use that opportunity to think they're stealing something of a high value, like TVs or whatever, or actually they're stealing radioactive material, which is not what you want them to do. So being mindful of how you manage that risk is going to be really important. And again, there's a whole host of security features you can incorporate into movements by road. So locks, seals on containers and on trucks, tracking devices, which you can include things like geofencing. So if you're going from A to B and you set the route up on the tracking system, if the truck is diverted for whatever reason, it will alarm in your control center and tell you. Immobilization devices can also be really helpful, particularly if you're under attack. Your driver can just pull the immobilization cord and get out the truck and walk away almost. So lots and lots of considerations to take from a road perspective. But a very popular form of transport. And as we mentioned earlier, if you're moving through a large area, like maybe multiple states, such as going through Europe, you also need to be mindful of the differing requirements as you go through those different states. So I'm going to leave it there, conscious of time. We'll move on to the next one, which is rail transport. So again, a very popular form of transport, very economical, and actually very environmentally friendly if done so in the right way. And a fantastic photo there of one of the DRS trains in the UK, actually not moving nuclear material, I might add, doing other business, but same locomotive they'd use. Really good from a quantity perspective, so you can move quite high quantities of material by rail, which is really helpful. And because the rail network is carefully managed, clearly from a safety perspective, it also means that the consistency of movements can be ensured, and you can track movements very carefully in terms of the signals, etc., that are used. It's also great from a public interaction perspective, apart from maybe having to pass through certain stations and certain towns. You pretty much stay away from populated areas, which is good. And obviously there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to mitigate trespass, which is a positive thing from a nuclear security perspective. One of the kind of challenges you might find with rail transport is the number of routes available to you. So usually there's only a limited number of routes. So again, as we mentioned earlier, if you have a routine regular schedule, you may want to think about changing that if you can on a frequent basis. You may also want to think carefully about how you would adopt a different route if there was an issue. So if there was a landslide, for example, over a rail line, what would you do? How would you move? And that's one of the constraints and challenges you have from a rail perspective. Similarly, most rail routes tend to be quite kind of away from the public, in kind of countryside areas, and therefore if there are incidents, you also need to think carefully about emergency response. So how will your first responders get to the transport if there's an issue? Not like being on the road where they can just drive up to it. So again, something you need to consider. And then finally, you also need to be mindful, as I mentioned earlier, about signals, stopping at signals, potentially stopping at stations, and line of sight as well. So if you're carrying nuclear material and you have to stop in a big station to pause for a signal, you may need to think about the security measures to ensure that continuity of transportation. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide, please, Isabel. Thank you. So next we're going to talk about marine transport. So again, a very economical form of transport. You can move much bigger quantities of material, particularly good for bulks. Again, very good from a public interaction perspective. Once the vessel has been loaded, it disappears off into international waters. And if you take our transports, for example, we can stay hundreds of miles away from land. We regularly do transports from Europe to America, Europe to Japan, for example, and we pretty much disappear. And that's really great from a security perspective. Can also be very flexible. So if we know there's bad weather, or if there's going to be an issue off the coast of the state, or if there's a high risk area due to piracy, we can just avoid them and be very flexible in terms of routes, which is helpful. However, there are some challenges. The first one around emergency response. If you're in the middle of nowhere and there's an issue, then obviously it is going to take time to get to those vessels. So you need to think about that carefully. We do a lot of work with countries to support us on that, and both with the IAEA as well. So you need to be mindful of what your emergency response looks like, having pre-designated pickup points, for example, for key materials, key tools that you might need to use to respond. We have those dotted around the world. The other key area to focus on is the number of stakeholders involved. So you'll appreciate to load a vessel, you need ports, you need pilots, the list goes on. So therefore, managing the security of information is really, really important, and something you're going to have to think about in terms of the way you plan your transports moving forward. Okay, so Isabel, if we could move on to actually the we'll skip the questions and move straight on to the current challenges, if that's okay, just because of time, and then we'll do a quick Q&A at the end. So to finish off, I just wanted to give you a really quick overview of some of the current challenges we're facing in the transport sector. I'm not going to go into any detail because of time on these, but again, I'm happy to talk about them afterwards. So firstly, denial of shipments. So we are seeing more and more ports, more and more carriers, whether that's air or marine, basically unwilling to move nuclear and radioactive materials. And for me, that's really down to a lack of understanding, a lack of education around the safety and security of these materials. So it's something that we continue to really work hard on, and something that myself and Martin, who's on the line, who's the Secretary General at WINTI, are really focusing our attention on at the moment. Public and political acceptance, again, is an issue. Some countries are now shutting down nuclear reactors, maybe moving away from a nuclear energy priority and focusing on different areas. So, being mindful of working with those states who might not be as comfortable with the transport of nuclear materials is really important, and sharing as much information as you can with them about the safety and security of your operations. And we do that through a global acceptance program where we work with a whole range of regions and states to really try and instill confidence that, what we do it with the highest levels of safety and security. Cybersecurity is a growing area for us. We've been working on this probably for a good 5-10 years now, both from an IT perspective, but also from an OT perspective. And what I mean is, from an OT perspective, is things like engine management systems, GPS systems, etc. We've started to see some GPS spoofing in certain regions in the world, which again, I'm happy to talk about afterwards. So again, if you're not thinking about cybersecurity of your assets, please go away and have a think about it. I don't just mean vessels, I mean, rail locomotives, which are now predominantly kind of electrical based, lots of computers supporting their use. Road as well, I mean, we're seeing a huge increase in smart cars, smart trucks. So have a think about the cybersecurity risk. I'm going to jump over the next couple and just focus on UAVs quickly. So you'll see a picture there from, I think that's from Gatwick Airport in the UK. So UAVs and drones are becoming a big challenge for the wider transport sector. It's something which we're doing an awful lot of work on. We actually have a project looking at this at the moment in the UK, and it's something you're going to have to be mindful of. It's great from a reconnaissance perspective, so watching your operations, but also really good from delivering payloads of explosives, for example. So again, something we need to work together as a sector to focus on. And then finally, I mean, identifying the right carrier. So some of you on the call today will be thinking about this sounds complex. How do I find the right carrier? Well, the good news is there's loads of us out there. Speak to WINTI, a really good place to identify who's around, who can help you. Speak to myself, I'm more than happy to help. There's lots of us out there who are here to help you. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, conscious of time. I actually said to Carl I thought I'd be under time, not over, so I failed. So Isabel, if we could move to the next slide. Thank you. So thank you everybody for listening. I hope you found that interesting. We'll continue with the Q&A now, but if you need any more information from me, or if you're interested in just having a chat, always happy to talk. My email is there, and also a link to our website if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about INS and what we do. So thank you again, and I hope that was good for everybody. Cheers.
Thank you, Ben. That was really good, really informative. Say thank you everyone for attending today's session. I hope you enjoyed it.